The wind howled across the empty wasteland as Ethan Carter stepped carefully over the twisted metal remains of a crashed alien ship. His boots crunched on the dry, cracked ground, the only sound besides the eerie creaks of the wreckage shifting in the breeze. He adjusted his tool belt, his sharp eyes scanning for anything valuable. Scavenging wasn't glamorous, but it paid for fuel and food. Sometimes, he got lucky and found old tech worth a fortune. Today, though, the ship seemed stripped clean. Nothing but hollow frames and scattered debris. Just as he was about to turn back, a faint noise caught his attention. It was almost like a cry. Ethan froze, his ears straining. The sound came again, soft and melodic, like a tiny voice calling for help. He frowned, gripping the handle of his pulse knife, and followed the sound deeper into the ship's remains. The path grew darker as the sun dipped behind a ridge, but Ethan pressed on. He ducked under a broken beam and pushed aside a tangled mess of cables. The sound grew louder, more urgent. His heart thumped in his chest. What could it be? Another scavenger. A trapped animal. Finally, he reached a small, enclosed chamber. A strange, metallic cage sat in the center, its bars glowing faintly with alien symbols. Inside the cage was a tiny figure, a young woman, no taller than his forearm. She had pale blue skin that shimmered faintly in the dim light, and her long, silvery hair cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall. Her delicate wings, folded against her back, looked almost transparent. She clung to the bars, her large, luminous eyes locking onto Ethan's with a mix of fear and hope. Ethan blinked, stunned. He had heard stories of miniature beings from distant planets, but he had never seen one himself. The woman's small hands gripped the cage bars, and she said something in a soft, unfamiliar language. Her voice trembled, and though Ethan didn't understand her words, her desperation was clear. "Who put you in here?" Ethan muttered, crouching to get a closer look. The cage's design was like nothing he'd ever seen. Its glowing symbols hummed faintly, and the bars were made of a strange, unbreakable metal. He tapped one with his knife, but it only sparked and vibrated. The woman flinched at the noise but didn't take her eyes off him. She pressed her face to the bars, speaking again, her voice pleading. Ethan scratched his head, feeling a pang of guilt. She wasn't just some artifact or treasure. She was alive. Someone had trapped her here, and judging by the state of the ship, she'd been left behind to die. All right, Ethan said, holding up his hands. "Don't freak out. I'll get you out of there." He pulled out his portable scanner and waved it over the cage. The device beeped angrily, spitting out lines of gibberish on its screen. "Great. Advanced tech. This'll take a minute." The woman tilted her head, watching him work. She seemed curious but cautious, keeping her distance from the glowing bars. Ethan worked quickly, using his tools to tinker with the locking mechanism. His fingers moved instinctively, guided by years of experience with alien tech. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the cage emitted a low hum and clicked open. The woman hesitated, her wide eyes flicking between Ethan and the now open door. He stepped back, giving her space. "Go on," he said gently. "You're free." Slowly, she stepped out, her tiny feet barely making a sound on the metal floor. She looked up at Ethan, then did something he didn't expect. She bowed, her wings trembling slightly, and whispered something in her soft voice. Ethan didn't understand the words, but her gratitude was unmistakable. "Yeah, you're welcome," he said with a nervous chuckle. But as he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that freeing her was just the beginning of something much bigger. Ethan watched as the tiny woman cautiously stepped out of the cage, her pale blue skin almost glowing in the dim light. She moved gracefully, but there was hesitation in every step, as if she wasn't sure whether she could trust the towering human before her. Her silver hair fell softly around her shoulders, and her wings gave a faint flutter, catching the light like delicate glass. Ethan knelt down to her level, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Don't worry. I'm not here to hurt you," he said, even though he doubted she understood him. "Do you have a name?" The woman tilted her head, her large eyes studying him. She opened her mouth and spoke softly, her voice like a whispering wind. The words were completely foreign, but her tone carried gratitude. Then she pointed to herself and said, "Kalira." Ethan nodded. "Kalira. All right. I'm Ethan." He tapped his chest to make it clear, and her expression softened. She repeated his name, though it came out slightly different, like Ethan. Ethan smiled despite the tension in the air. For a moment, it felt like they were bridging the vast gap between their worlds. But the moment didn't last. A sharp sound echoed through the wreckage, metal scraping against metal. Ethan's head snapped up, his instincts kicking in. Someone, or something, was nearby. Kalira's wings fluttered in panic, and she grabbed his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. "Quiet," Ethan whispered, pulling her close. He scanned the area, his pulse knife already in his hand. The sound grew louder, followed by heavy footsteps. Whoever it was, they weren't friendly. Ethan peeked through a gap in the wreckage and spotted them, a group of alien hunters. They were tall, armored figures with reptilian features, their glowing visors scanning the debris. One of them carried a device that beeped steadily, pointing them toward Kalira's location. They were tracking her. "Great," Ethan muttered under his breath. He didn't need to be a genius to figure out what was happening. These hunters had been the ones who locked her up. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to recapture her, and if they found him helping her, they wouldn't hesitate to kill him. Kalira tugged on his sleeve again, her wide eyes full of fear. Ethan looked down at her and whispered, "Stay close to me. We're getting out of here." Moving quickly but quietly, Ethan led Kalira through the maze of twisted metal, keeping to the shadows. He knew the wreckage well enough to find an escape route, but the hunters weren't far behind. Their beeping tracker grew louder, and their guttural voices echoed through the ship. Ethan's heart raced as he ducked under a low beam, Kalira following closely. He could feel her trembling, but she didn't make a sound. The exit was just ahead, a jagged opening in the ship's hull that led to open ground. But as they approached, one of the hunters stepped into view, blocking their path. The alien snarled, raising a plasma rifle. Ethan didn't hesitate. He threw a piece of scrap metal to the side, the noise drawing the hunter's attention just long enough for him to charge forward. His pulse knife hummed as he struck, disabling the hunter with a precise blow to its armor. "Run," Ethan shouted to Kalira, grabbing her hand. The two of them bolted through the opening, the sound of the other hunters chasing after them. Outside, the wasteland stretched endlessly under a darkening sky. Ethan spotted his small ship in the distance, its hull half buried in sand. "That's our way out," he said, pulling Kalira along. They sprinted toward the ship, dodging plasma blasts that scorched the ground around them. Kalira stumbled but kept running, her wings flapping weakly. Ethan pushed himself harder, determined to get them both to safety. Finally, they'd reached the ship. Ethan hit the control panel, and the ramp lowered with a hiss. He shoved Kalira inside and turned to face the hunters, who were closing in fast. "This just keeps getting better," he muttered, pulling out his pulse rifle and preparing to make a stand. Ethan stood at the base of his ship's ramp, gripping his pulse rifle tightly. The alien hunters were closing in, their visors glowing ominously in the darkening wasteland. Plasma blasts streaked past him, lighting up the night. Kalira peeked out from inside the ship, her small hands clutching the edge of the door. Her wide eyes were filled with fear. "Stay inside," Ethan shouted, his voice firm but reassuring. "I'll handle this." The lead hunter snarled something in its guttural language, signaling the others to surround the ship. Ethan knew he couldn't take on all of them, but he didn't need to. He just needed to buy time. With practiced precision, he fired a few warning shots, hitting the ground near the hunter's feet. The bright flashes momentarily blinded them, giving Ethan a brief advantage. He sprinted up the ramp, slamming the controls to retract it. The ramp closed with a loud hiss, sealing them inside. "Kalira, Hold on to something, he called out, running to the cockpit. His boots clanged on the metal floor as he slid into the pilot's seat and powered up the ship. The engines roared to life, shaking the entire vessel. Outside, the hunters regrouped, their leader barking orders. They raised their weapons, firing plasma bolts at the ship. Sparks flew as the blasts hit the outer hull, but Ethan's old ship was tougher than it looked. "Let's see how you like this," he muttered, flipping a switch. The ship's thrusters ignited, sending a fiery blast toward the hunters. They dove for cover as Ethan pulled the controls, lifting the ship off the ground. Sand and debris swirled in the air as the vessel rose higher and higher. Kalira stumbled into the cockpit, clutching the back of Ethan's chair to keep herself steady. "Eat N," she said, her voice trembling but determined. She pointed toward the window, where the hunters had climbed into their own small craft to give chase. "Yeah, I see them," Ethan said, glancing at the radar. The hunter's ship was fast, and it was gaining on them. He gritted his teeth. His old freighter wasn't built for combat, and he didn't have any heavy weapons on board. This is gonna get rough. The hunter's ship fired a barrage of plasma bolts. The freighter shook violently as one blast grazed the engines. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit. "Great, just what I needed," Ethan grumbled, quickly adjusting the controls. Kalira, still holding on tightly, looked at the flashing lights and then at Ethan. She reached out and touched a panel near his hand. Her fingers glowed faintly as alien symbols appeared on the screen. Ethan stared in disbelief. "What are you doing?" Kalira's voice was soft but steady. "Help, ship," she said, her words halting but clear. The symbols on the panel shifted, and suddenly, the freighter's systems responded. The engines roared with renewed power, and the ship surged forward at a speed Ethan didn't think was possible. "You just upgraded my ship?" Ethan asked, half in awe and half in confusion. Kalira nodded, her small face determined. "All right then, let's see what this baby can do." Ethan pulled the controls sharply, sending the freighter into a tight barrel roll. The hunter's ship fired again, but the blasts missed as Ethan maneuvered with newfound agility. "They're not gonna like this," he said, smirking. Kalira clung to the seat, her wings fluttering slightly as she watched Ethan expertly outmaneuver their pursuers. The freighter's new speed and responsiveness gave them the edge they needed. Within moments, they had left the hunter's ship far behind. As the radar cleared, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We're safe, for now," he said, glancing at Kalira. "That was some trick you pulled back there." Kalira gave a small smile, but her strength was fading. She leaned against the chair, her breathing shallow. Ethan frowned, concern filling his voice. "Hey, are you all right?" She nodded weakly. "Use too much." Ethan gently picked her up and carried her to a small bunk in the corner of the ship. "You rest. I'll figure out where to go next," he said, covering her with a blanket. As Kalira drifted off to sleep, Ethan sat in the cockpit, staring out at the endless stars. He had no idea what he'd gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. He couldn't abandon her now. Ethan leaned back in the cockpit, his eyes scanning the vast darkness of space. Stars twinkled in the distance, but their beauty was lost on him. His mind was racing. Who were these hunters? Why were they so desperate to capture Kalira? And what exactly was she? The soft sound of movement made him turn. Kalira had woken up and stood in the doorway of the cockpit, her tiny frame leaning against the wall for support. She still looked pale, but her eyes were bright and curious. "You should be resting," Ethan said, motioning for her to sit in the co-pilot's seat. She climbed into it carefully, her delicate wings folding neatly behind her. Kalira gave a small smile and spoke softly. "Better now." "Thank you." Ethan studied her for a moment. She was clearly no ordinary being. Her earlier display of power had saved them, but it had also drained her. He needed answers, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. "Kalira," he began gently, "who were those people chasing you? Why were you locked up?" Her expression darkened, and she looked down at her hands. After a long pause, she began to speak, her words halting but earnest. They, bad people, took me, my home, wanted my power. Your power? Ethan asked, leaning forward. What kind of power? Kalira hesitated, searching for the right words. She placed a hand on the console, and once again, the alien symbols glowed faintly. The ship's systems hummed, reacting to her touch. I connect. Machines, life, energy. They use me as tool. Ethan's eyes widened. He'd heard rumors of beings with abilities like hers, but he'd never believed them. If what she said was true, it explained why the hunters wanted her so badly. She wasn't just unique, she was valuable. They wanted to use you like a battery, Ethan muttered, anger rising in his voice. That's disgusting. Kalira nodded, her expression sad but resolute. I escape, hide, until you. Ethan felt a pang of guilt. She had been through so much, and now she was depending on him. A simple scavenger with no grand plan or allies. But he couldn't let her down. Not after what she'd been through. We'll keep you safe, Ethan said firmly. I don't care how far we have to go. Kalira looked at him, her eyes softening. Thank you, Ethan. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a sudden beeping from the ship's console. Ethan leaned over and checked the radar. A large ship was approaching fast, far bigger than the hunter's small craft from earlier. His heart sank as he recognized the insignia on its hull. The corporation, he muttered under his breath. These weren't random hunters. They were working for one of the galaxy's largest and most ruthless organizations. If they had tracked Kalira this far, it meant they weren't giving up anytime soon. Kalira sensed his worry and touched his arm. What? Wrong. Ethan gestured to the radar. More trouble. They've found us again. Kalira's wings fluttered nervously. We run. Ethan shook his head. No point. That ship's too fast, and they've got more firepower than we can handle. He thought for a moment. Then a risky idea formed in his mind. But I've got another plan. Kalira tilted her head, watching him intently. Plan. Ethan nodded, his fingers flying across the controls. We're heading into an asteroid field. It's dangerous, but it'll give us cover. They won't be able to track us as easily. Kalira didn't look convinced, but she trusted him. Okay, I help. As the freighter veered toward the jagged cluster of rocks, Ethan tightened his grip on the controls. The ship rattled as it entered the field, dodging massive asteroids that loomed like silent giants. Behind them, the corporation's ship hesitated, its size making it difficult to navigate the tight spaces. Ethan grinned. Looks like they're not as brave as they thought. Kalira placed her hand on the console again, her energy sparking faintly. I, guide ship. You, fly. Deal, Ethan said, feeling a surge of confidence. Together, they maneuvered through the deadly field, the hunter's ship falling further behind. For now, they were safe. But Ethan knew this was just the beginning of their fight. Ethan steered the freighter through the dense asteroid field, his hands gripping the controls tightly. The ship rattled and groaned under the strain, but it held steady. Massive rocks tumbled and spun around them, each one large enough to crush the freighter in an instant. The console beeped constantly, warning of incoming collisions. Kalira, Ethan said through gritted teeth, if you've got any more tricks up your sleeve, now's the time. Kalira, seated beside him, placed her delicate hand on the console again. Her eyes closed, and a faint glow surrounded her fingertips as alien symbols appeared on the screen. The ship's systems responded instantly, mapping a safer route through the chaos. Follow, here, she said, pointing to the display. Ethan nodded, trusting her completely. Got it. The ship swerved sharply, narrowly missing a jagged asteroid that came spinning toward them. Ethan's heart pounded, but he focused on Kalira's guidance. Her abilities seemed to merge with the ship, making it more responsive and agile than ever before. Behind them, the corporation's massive ship struggled to keep up. Its size made it difficult to maneuver through the tight spaces, and the asteroid field worked in Ethan's favor. He could see the ship falling further back on the radar. "They're having a hard time," Ethan muttered, a small grin forming on his face. "Good." Kalira opened her eyes, her expression still tense. "Not safe yet." Ethan's grin faded. She was right. Even if they managed to escape the asteroid field, the corporation wouldn't stop hunting them. He needed a plan, something that would throw them off for good. "All right," he said, glancing at her. "We'll figure out where to hide once we're out of here. There's got to be a place where they can't find us." Kalira hesitated before speaking. "No place. Far. Hidden." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You've got a safe place in mind." She nodded. "Home. Old place. They cannot go." Her broken sentences only made him more curious. But there wasn't time to press for details. "If it's safe, we'll go there," he said firmly. "Just tell me how to get there." Kalira seemed relieved, her small frame relaxing slightly. Guide." The freighter finally emerged from the asteroid field, the vastness of space stretching out before them. Ethan let out a sigh of relief but stayed alert. He checked the radar and was pleased to see that the corporation's ship hadn't followed them through the field. For now, they were alone. He leaned back in his chair, trying to catch his breath. That was close. Kalira smiled faintly, her wings fluttering softly. "You, brave." Ethan chuckled. "Brave? More like lucky." But their moment of calm was interrupted by a soft peep from the console. Kalira's expression turned serious as she pointed to the display. "Signal. Tracking." Ethan groaned. "They're still tracking us." "How?" Kalira tapped the screen, her face thoughtful. "Device. Hidden." Ethan frowned. "You're saying they planted a tracker on the ship?" She nodded. "Before we leave. Must find." Ethan cursed under his breath. It made sense now. The corporation hadn't just been following them. They'd known exactly where they were the whole time. He stood up, motioning for Kalira to stay put. "I'll find it. You keep us steady." Kalira watched him go, her wings twitching nervously. Ethan searched the ship's interior, checking every corner and compartment. Finally, he found it, a small, sleek device tucked away near the engine. It was embedded in a panel, its blinking light mocking him. "Got you," Ethan muttered, prying it loose. He returned to the cockpit and showed it to Kalira. "This is what they've been using." Kalira nodded. "Destroy." Ethan grinned, with pleasure. He placed the tracker in an airlock, then hit the release button. The small device was sucked out into space, spinning into the void. Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. "No more tracking," he said, sitting back down. Kalira smiled softly. "Safe, for now." But as Ethan looked out at the endless stars, he couldn't shake the feeling that their real challenge was still ahead. Ethan leaned back in the pilot's seat, staring out at the endless void of space. The stars seemed to stretch forever, but even their beauty couldn't calm the uneasy feeling in his chest. The tracker was gone, but he knew better than to let his guard down. The corporation wouldn't give up so easily. Kalira sat quietly beside him, her small hands resting on her lap. Her wings fluttered faintly, a sign she was deep in thought. Ethan glanced at her, noticing the tired look on her face. She had been through so much, yet she hadn't complained once. "You all right?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Kalira nodded, her voice soft. "Tired, but okay." Ethan smiled faintly. "You've earned a rest. I'll take care of the flying." Kalira shook her head. "Must. Guide. Safe place. Far." Ethan hesitated. He didn't like the idea of pushing her too hard, but they didn't have many options. "All right," he said finally. "You guide, I'll handle the rest." Kalira pointed to the navigation console, her fingers glowing faintly as she input coordinates. Alien symbols filled the screen, and the ship's autopilot began recalibrating their course. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Where are we going?" he asked. Kalira looked at him, her large eyes serious. "Sanctuary. Old. Hidden world. Safe from them." Ethan frowned, curiosity gnawing at him. "What kind of place is this? Why is it safe?" Kalira hesitated, her wings twitching nervously. "My people, long ago, built to hide. Only. I know." Her broken explanation left Ethan with more questions than answers, but he decided not to press her. If it was a safe haven, that was all that mattered. "All right," he said, leaning back. "Sanctuary it is." The ship's engines hummed as they entered hyperspace, the stars outside stretching into brilliant lines of light. Ethan relaxed slightly, letting the autopilot handle the journey. Kalira's gaze shifted to the window, her expression distant. Ethan watched her for a moment before speaking. "Kalira, you said your people built this place. What happened to them?" Her eyes filled with sadness, and she took a deep breath before answering. "Gone. Long time ago. War. My kind. Hunted." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. A race with powers like hers would have been seen as a threat, or worse, a resource to exploit. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You're the last of your kind." Kalira nodded. "Yes. Alone. Until you." The weight of her words hit Ethan hard. She had lost everything, yet she still found the strength to fight for her survival. He couldn't help but admire her resilience. "You're not alone anymore," Ethan said firmly. "I've got your back." Kalira's lips curved into a small smile. "Thank you, Ethan." Their quiet moment was interrupted by a sudden jolt. The ship shuddered violently, alarms blaring across the cockpit. Ethan shot up, his hands flying over the controls. "What now?" Kalira gripped the seat, her wings fluttering in alarm. "What happening?" Ethan scanned the console and cursed under his breath. "We're being pulled out of hyperspace. Someone's using a gravity well." The ship dropped back into normal space with a lurch, the stars snapping back into their usual positions. In front of them loomed a massive station, its metallic surface bristling with weapons. Ethan's stomach sank as he recognized the insignia on the station's hull. "The corporation," he muttered. "They set a trap." Kalira's eyes widened, and she clutched his arm. "What we do?" Ethan clenched his jaw, his mind racing. The station was too well armed for a direct fight, and their ship wasn't built for stealth. But he wasn't about to give up. "We're going to outsmart them," he said, determination hardening his voice. "Hold on, Kalira. This is going to get messy." He tightened his grip on the controls and prepared for the fight of their lives. Ethan's heart raced as the massive corporation station loomed larger in the view screen. Their freighter was caught in its gravity well, unable to escape. Ethan gripped the controls, his fingers moving with practiced precision, but his mind was focused on one thing: survival. The corporation wouldn't just capture them. They'd take Kalira and use her abilities for their own gain. He couldn't let that happen. "We need to think fast," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. Kalira sat beside him, her wings twitching nervously. "What do?" Ethan glanced at her. "We're going to make it look like we're surrendering, but we're not. I need you to keep the systems active. Help me get around their security." Kalira nodded, her small hands moving toward the control panel. "I help." Ethan watched her work for a moment before turning his attention back to the station ahead. The station's defenses were massive, and he knew they would be expecting a fight, but he wasn't going to give them one. Not yet. The freighter wasn't built for combat, and if they tried to shoot their way out, they'd be destroyed before they could get a chance to escape. His only hope was to use their enemy's confidence against them. As they approached the docking bay, Ethan began to send out a distress signal, playing it up like a desperate plea for help. "This is Ethan Carter aboard the freighter Starlight, requesting immediate assistance. We've been damaged, and were unable to escape. Kalira glanced at him, her face filled with uncertainty. "Is this safe?" "Trust me," Ethan replied with a confident smile, though his mind was racing. "It'll work." The freighter slowly moved toward the docking bay, the ship's comms crackling with the station's response. "Freighter Starlight, you are under our control. Prepare to be boarded for inspection. Any resistance will be met with force." Ethan exhaled slowly, playing his part. "Understood. We comply." As they entered the docking bay, Ethan's eyes darted around, taking in every detail. He noticed the armed guards stationed near the airlocks, their weapons raised and ready. It was a small force, but their technology was superior, and they had the advantage in numbers. The ship came to a gentle stop, and the ramp lowered with a hiss. Ethan stood, adjusting his jacket. "Stay calm, Kalira. Let me do the talking." Kalira nodded, but her small form trembled slightly. Ethan could sense her fear, and it made him even more determined to keep her safe. He needed to stay calm and think on his feet. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. A group of heavily armed soldiers entered the ship, their armor clanking as they moved in. The lead soldier, a tall figure with a cruel expression, stepped forward and pointed his rifle at Ethan. "Step away from the controls. You're coming with us." Ethan slowly raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. "Of course, but I have one request," he said, trying to sound as compliant as possible. "The woman, Kalira. You take her first. She's the one you want." The soldier narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious. "Keep talking." Ethan motioned toward Kalira, who was seated in the cockpit, her eyes wide but watching everything. "She's the one you've been hunting. You'll need her to fix your ships, your weapons. She can make them work better than they ever have. She can power up anything. Just take her, and I'll come quietly." The soldier looked back at his team, his gaze cold. After a long pause, he finally nodded. "All right, take her first." As the guards moved toward Kalira, she tensed up, but Ethan kept his eyes on the soldier. He had to keep them distracted, to buy Kalira a few extra moments. He waited until the guards were close to her, then hit the button under his seat. The ship's internal systems, which Kalira had helped boost earlier, powered up instantly. With a sudden jolt, the ramp sealed shut, and the ship's engines roared to life. The guards outside shouted in confusion as the freighter shot upward, breaking free from the station's hold. The corporation's soldiers scrambled to their feet, shouting orders and opening fire, but the freighter was already in the air, moving too fast for them to track. Ethan grinned, his hand steady on the controls. "Nice work, Kalira. You just saved us." Kalira, breathing heavily, smiled weakly. "We escape." Ethan's heart still pounded, but relief flooded through him. The ship was now in open space, away from the station, and its deadly grasp. Kalira turned to him, her expression serious again. "Where? Now?" Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes focused on the endless stars ahead. "Now we get as far away as we can. And then, we plan our next move." Ethan's hands were still shaking as he piloted the freighter away from the corporation station. He could hear the distant thrum of the engines and feel the tension in the air as the ship drifted into the cold emptiness of space. They had escaped, barely, but the real danger wasn't over yet. The corporation was powerful, and it wasn't going to give up on capturing Kalira. He glanced at her. She was seated quietly in the co-pilot's seat, her wings folded tightly behind her. Her face was pale, and her eyes were distant, but there was a hint of relief in her expression. They were free for now, but how long would it last? "What now?" Kalira asked softly, her voice still weak from the strain of the escape. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat. He had been thinking about that question for the last few minutes, but the answer wasn't easy. "We need to lay low," he said. "The corporation's not going to stop chasing us. We'll have to find somewhere they can't track us." Kalira nodded slowly. Where? Safe. Ethan rubbed his chin, thinking. I'm not sure. But I've got a few contacts on a couple of out-of-the-way planets. We can start there. Kalira seemed to relax a little at the idea of a plan, but her eyes kept flicking to the windows, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Ethan understood. He felt the same way. They flew in silence for a while, the stars stretching out before them, distant and cold. Ethan checked the ship's systems, making sure everything was running smoothly. They were low on fuel and supplies, and the damage to the engines from their last escape had drained most of the ship's resources. They couldn't keep running forever. Ethan, Kalira said suddenly, her voice urgent. They follow. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He rushed to the controls, checking the radar. A small blip appeared in the distance, growing steadily larger. It wasn't the corporation's ship, but it was definitely a ship, one that was closing in fast. Damn it, Ethan muttered. We've got more company. Kalira's eyes widened. Who? Ethan didn't have an answer. The ship was too far out to identify, but it was definitely coming for them. He slammed a button on the console, turning the freighter's engines up to maximum. The ship lurched forward as they accelerated, trying to put distance between them and whoever was chasing them. The unknown ship matched their speed, closing in on them with alarming precision. Ethan's grip tightened on the controls. They couldn't outrun it, and they didn't have the firepower to fight it. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. Hold on, Ethan said to Kalira, his voice steady but filled with urgency. We're going to take a risk. Kalira didn't hesitate. She nodded and turned to the control panel, her fingers glowing faintly as she manipulated the ship's systems. She was guiding the ship. But this time, it was different. There was a concentration in her movements, a quiet power as she focused on the task at hand. Ethan made a sharp turn to the left, diving toward a nearby asteroid field. The ship's engines screamed as they veered off course, weaving between massive chunks of rock. The pursuing ship followed them into the field, but Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before it lost their trail. He glanced at Kalira. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, her energy flickering as she adjusted their course, helping them avoid the larger asteroids. We can't keep this up forever, Ethan said. We need a way out. Kalira's voice was calm, almost too calm. I can help. Get away. Ethan raised an eyebrow. How? She looked up at him, her expression serious. Hide. In plain sight. I'd make ship. Disappear. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. You can do that. Kalira nodded. Yes, I can. Cloak us. But I need energy. Ethan didn't hesitate. Do it. We don't have a choice. Kalira placed her hand on the console again, her fingers glowing brighter now as she channeled her energy into the ship's systems. The freighter shuddered as a ripple passed through it, and for a moment, it felt like the entire ship had vanished. The radar showed nothing, no trace of the freighter. They were invisible. The pursuing ship zoomed past them, completely unaware of their presence. Ethan held his breath, watching as the enemy ship continued forward, its sensors unable to detect them. Kalira pulled her hand away from the console, breathing heavily. We did it. Ethan exhaled in relief, his pulse racing. Nice work, Kalira. But as he glanced at the stars ahead, he knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. They had a brief moment of safety, but the real battle was still to come. The corporation would stop at nothing to get Kalira, and Ethan wasn't sure how far he was willing to go to protect her. The freighter glided silently through the vast emptiness of space, hidden from view by Kalira's cloak. The stars twinkled in the distance, but Ethan couldn't enjoy their beauty. His mind was focused on the danger that still loomed over them. They were safe for now, but only for a little while. He knew the corporation wouldn't stop looking for them. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He was exhausted, both mentally and physically, but he knew they couldn't rest for long. Kalira had collapsed in the seat beside him, her energy drained from cloaking the ship. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. He glanced over at her. Her pale blue skin glowed faintly in the dim light of the cockpit, and her silver hair shimmered like threads of starlight. She had saved them again, but at what cost? How much more could she give before she broke? As if sensing his thoughts, Kalira stirred, her wings fluttering slightly. She opened her eyes, blinking as if trying to adjust to the light. "Eat, N," she whispered weakly. Ethan straightened up in his seat. "Hey, you're awake. How do you feel?" She took a slow, shaky breath, her small hands clutching the armrest. "Tired, but fine." Ethan's heart sank. He had to find a way to help her. She couldn't keep going like this. "You pushed yourself too hard," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We need to find a safe place, a real one. Somewhere you can rest and recover." Kalira nodded, but her eyes were distant. "Safe place. I know. Where?" Ethan frowned. "Where?" She didn't respond right away. She seemed lost in thought for a moment, then slowly pointed to a spot on the star map. "There. An old, hidden place. Far from them. Only. I know." Ethan leaned forward, studying the map. It was far, but it was their only option. If Kalira was right, this place could be their sanctuary, the place where the corporation couldn't reach them. He'd do whatever it took to get there. He set the coordinates and engaged the ship's engines, feeling the hum beneath his feet as the freighter began to move again. "We'll get there," he said quietly, more to himself than to Kalira. "Hang in there." The next few hours passed in a blur. Ethan kept the ship on course, trying to block out the nagging worry in the back of his mind. He checked the systems constantly, making sure they weren't being followed. Kalira had fallen asleep again, her breathing slower and steadier now that she had a chance to rest. As they traveled, the silence between them felt heavier. There was so much he wanted to ask her, to understand about her past and the dangerous powers she had. But he knew now wasn't the time. She needed to recover, and they needed to get to safety. Finally, the freighter reached its destination. A small, uncharted planet appeared on the view screen, its surface covered in thick forests and rocky mountains. It was beautiful, but more importantly, it was isolated. No signs of life, no ships in orbit, just the quiet, untouched world that Kalira had led them to. "We're here," Ethan said softly, bringing the freighter into orbit. Kalira stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open as the ship slowed to a stop. She looked out the window, her expression softening. "Here. Home. For now." Ethan nodded. "For now. But we're safe. For now." The freighter descended toward the surface, cutting through the thick atmosphere and landing gently in a clearing among the trees. Ethan powered down the engines and turned to Kalira. "This is it. You can rest here. We can figure things out." Kalira smiled faintly, her eyes tired but filled with relief. "Thank you, Ethan." Ethan smiled back, though the weight of what lay ahead still lingered in his chest. They had escaped the corporation, but they weren't free yet. This planet could be their sanctuary, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was still to come. As the freighter's ramp lowered, he helped Kalira to her feet, his hand steady on her small shoulder. They stepped outside into the cool air of the unknown world, the vast wilderness stretching out before them. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. But he knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The corporation would find them eventually. And when they did, they'd have to be ready to fight.